Imagine an invention so disruptive, it doesn't just challenge the status quo. It threatens to rewrite it. That's exactly what happened when a quiet Zimbabwean innovator named Maxwell Chikumbutso rolled out a mysterious device the world now calls the MSED. A box with no fuel, no visible energy input, and yet it powered devices for hours. For mainstream physics, this wasn't just unusual. It was impossible. So how did this obscure inventor end up dragging the global scientific community into a $100 million wager? And more importantly, why are physicists, engineers, defense analysts, and energy investors suddenly unable to look away? Because if Maxwell is right, it means the world's most fundamental energy equations are incomplete, maybe even wrong. The story begins not in Silicon Valley, but in a small workshop in Harare, where early prototypes hummed quietly in the background as if unaware of the scientific chaos they would later unleash. Visitors described it as surreal, a metal box powering televisions, radios, and lights without connecting to the grid. Engineers inspected it, traced wires, checked the walls for hidden cabling. They found nothing. The device worked even outdoors, away from the building entirely. Yet every time someone asked for the math behind it, Maxwell's answer was unsettlingly blunt. The math didn't exist yet. Reporters dismissed it as a stunt. Scientists called it pseudoscience. But the device kept working. And that was enough for a select group of African tech founders and foreign investors to take notice. They didn't care whether it fit inside established theory. They cared that it worked. That's when the real pushback began. In physics, the laws are clear. You don't get more energy out than you put in. Maxwell's prototypes appeared to ignore that rule entirely. To leading academics, this felt like watching someone casually violate gravity in broad daylight. One prominent astrophysicist went so far as to declare on live television that MSED should be physically impossible unless our understanding of the universe is incomplete. He said it with a laugh, but the implications were deadly serious. Then everything escalated when an international research fund offered a $100 million prize to any certified scientific team able to fully debunk, explain, or replicate Maxwell's device under controlled conditions. That move changed the entire conversation. Overnight, what some had called a scam became one of the largest open scientific challenges in modern history. Universities formed teams. Defense labs quietly inquired. Energy tycoons sent intermediaries. Everyone wanted clarity or control. Suddenly, physicists found themselves in a strange position. They could no longer ignore Maxwell without risking being left behind. But engaging with his work meant acknowledging that a self-sustaining power source might exist outside their current theoretical frameworks. That was a professional nightmare. They had built careers on those frameworks. Still, curiosity won over ego for some. Maxwell began receiving requests to license or test the technology in European labs, Asian research centers, and American private facilities. He rejected most of them, insisting on African oversight. And that decision made him a hero to some and a target to others. Meanwhile, investigative journalists started digging. They found former engineers who claimed Maxwell's labs housed classified prototypes far beyond what the public had seen. Others spoke of test flights with electric drones running off miniature MSED units. And yet, for every person insisting the technology was real, there was a scientist on the other side saying it simply couldn't be. That tension between what appears to be happening and what physics allows became the fuel behind the global frenzy. What happens if Maxwell is wrong? Then the mystery ends, investors walk away, and science continues unchanged. But what if he's right? The consequences are staggering. Oil markets destabilize. Power grids become obsolete. Energy poverty collapses. Districts without electricity leapfrog into the future overnight. The very architecture of modern civilization shifts. Governments know this, which is why intelligence analysts quietly monitor the situation. Energy economists now model outcomes with and without MSED-class technologies included. And major power companies subtly lobby against its legitimacy. Because for them, this isn't science fiction. It's an existential threat. But here's the twist. Despite the uproar, Maxwell refuses to present MSED as a miracle. He calls it an engineering discovery, not a spiritual one. He argues that humanity has misunderstood how energy interacts with space itself, and that the missing equations will emerge from this challenge. Whether he's a visionary or delusional depends entirely on who you ask. And that's precisely what makes the story so gripping. There are real prototypes, real demonstrations, real labs trying and failing to explain them. And now, a $100 million prize pushing the global research community into uncharted territory. But the most surprising development didn't come from academia or venture capital. It came from a growing cluster of African inventors who began building their own experimental devices, inspired by what they saw. From Kenya to Ghana to Rwanda, small engineering hubs sprang up with the shared belief that the continent might be standing on the edge of an energy revolution that didn't come from Europe, China, or the United States, but from one of their own. Unlike the previous units, which were small, closed metal boxes meant for lab benches and indoor demonstrations, the MSEDX was built into a ruggedized chassis roughly the size of a motorcycle engine. It had heat sinks, modular mounting rails, and standardized power output ports. It didn't look like a mystery anymore. It looked like hardware. Industrial hardware. Within minutes of unveiling it to a limited audience of engineers, investors, and journalists, phones were out, photos were taken, and the internet did the rest. Just the sight of the unit sparked chaos globally. Because for the first time, the device wasn't powering lamps or TVs. It was ready to be mounted in bikes, small vehicles, and drones. Suddenly, the debate shifted from "is it real?" to "if it's real, who controls it?" And that's when Africa's energy narrative started to splinter into two camps, the empiricists and the pragmatists. The empiricists were scientists from top institutions, determined to test the device under internationally accepted protocols. Their stance was simple: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they were willing to provide the testing environment to get it. This group wasn't hostile, just cautious. They wanted math, metrics, replication, peer review. The pragmatists, on the other hand, were innovators and entrepreneurs from the continent who had lived through energy scarcity firsthand. To them, if it worked, theory could catch up later. They argued that the West spent decades telling Africa to wait for development, and now that something groundbreaking might be emerging from the continent itself, the world suddenly wanted slow, formal validation. The quotes floating around African tech circles summed it up. Europe asked for permission, Silicon Valley asked for forgiveness. Africa shouldn't have to ask at all. The tension between these worldviews reached a peak when a Kenyan robotics startup integrated an MSEDX unit into a lightweight electric cargo bike. The bike ran continuously during a filmed field test, transporting supplies across rural roads without swapping batteries or charging. That video alone racked up millions of views, not because it proved anything conclusively, but because it made the scientific arguments suddenly feel secondary to the real-world potential. Still, the backlash was swift. Energy analysts warned the public not to confuse anecdotal demonstrations with scientific proof. Physicists published papers outlining why a device like MSEDX would violate conservation laws. And major media outlets began running headlines like, "The physics-defying engine Africa won't stop talking about." The narrative had officially moved from fringe curiosity to mainstream spectacle. Back in Zimbabwe, Maxwell watched it all unfold quietly. Insiders later said he knew the fight was never about the device, it was about credibility. The $100 million challenge had forced the scientific establishment to engage. The MSEDX forced the business world to engage. Now it was time for governments to do the same. And they did, though not publicly at first. Diplomatic cables and leaked memos hinted that several African energy ministries requested private demonstrations. A military research wing from a major non-African nation allegedly offered a technology secrecy agreement in exchange for exclusive access. Tech giants sent representatives disguised as consultants. And while none of these overtures were confirmed officially, every rumor added fuel to the spectacle. Then came the defining moment: the Pretoria trials. For the first time, Maxwell agreed to a controlled, instrumented test overseen by a panel of engineers from universities across South Africa, Botswana, Kenya, and Namibia. No cameras, No live streams. No media circus. Just strict measuring equipment, sealed environments, and verification protocols. What happened inside that lab remained confidential for weeks, until a member of the panel leaked a simple statement to a journalist. The device produced sustained power output without observable external input for longer than expected under controlled conditions. We have no conventional explanation at this time. That single sentence ignited the fire all over again. Investors began gathering funds. Engineers requested research partnerships. And ordinary people asked the question no one wanted to confront. What if Maxwell isn't breaking physics? What if physics is incomplete? Meanwhile, the $100 million prize organizers tightened their evaluation criteria. Teams were now required not just to debunk or replicate Maxwell, but to produce a theoretical framework that could explain what they observed. Because without a theory, the invention would remain an anomaly. And anomalies are the lifeblood of scientific revolutions. By this point, even the skeptics were divided. Some insisted there had to be an undiscovered fuel source or hidden mechanism. Others, reluctantly, admitted that breakthroughs in history often looked like violations of known laws until new laws replaced them. Maxwell himself fueled the debate by claiming that energy could be harnessed from what he called ambient spatial fields, a concept that hovered awkwardly between engineering and theoretical physics. While the world argued, Africa moved. Rwanda announced exploratory grants for non-grid energy systems. Ghana's tech ministry quietly opened an advanced materials research program. Nigerian universities launched seminars on emergent energy frameworks. For the first time, African scientific development wasn't following global narratives, it was driving them. And the irony was impossible to ignore. For over a century, African nations had been treated as consumers of Western technology. Now Western institutions were scrambling to interpret an African invention that refused to fit their models. The stakes were higher than ever. If MSEDX was real, it wouldn't just disrupt markets, it would redraw them. Countries rich in sunlight but poor in oil could suddenly lead. Rural villages without power lines could leapfrog industrial infrastructure entirely. And the gatekeepers of global energy, from oil cartels to power utilities, would have to answer a terrifying question. What happens when energy becomes portable, clean, and practically infinite? Governments, scientists, and corporations had all taken their positions. Not a corporation. Not a startup. Not a secretive lab hidden behind NDAs. A coalition. Maxwell declared that instead of selling the MSEDX to the highest bidder or locking it behind patents, he was partnering with universities, fabrication labs, and small manufacturers across Africa to build what he called distributed energy capacity. His reasoning was simple: if one country owned the tech, they'd be pressured. If one corporation owned it, they'd be bought. If one lab controlled it, it could be silenced. But if 50 independent facilities across the continent could produce their own units, the system couldn't be stopped, it could only be adopted. That announcement stunned the audience. It was a political move disguised as an engineering strategy, and it caught the world off guard. Because with that single decision, Maxwell not only disrupted markets, he disrupted power, literally and figuratively. Within days, headlines erupted. Africa refuses to sell energy future. Coalition model threatens Western monopoly. Oil markets brace for disruption. And buried between the noise were quieter voices, African students who finally saw a future where their education mattered globally. Researchers who'd been overlooked suddenly receiving funding. Engineers who had spent years working on power electronics but never got a shot, now being asked to lead labs. But the move also triggered a storm on the other side of the world. Energy cartels pushed for classification of the tech as strategic infrastructure, which would allow certain governments to restrict its export under national security law. Financial analysts warned that if the device proved scalable, trillions in fossil fuel infrastructure could become stranded assets. And major trading firms quietly began restructuring portfolios to hedge against emergent energy risk, a phrase that didn't exist before Maxwell. Meanwhile, the scientific establishment doubled down. The $100 million prize committee announced that the contest would now enter Phase 2, focusing on theoretical analysis, laboratory replication, and device-independent validation. This phase wouldn't determine whether Maxwell could build more units. It would determine whether the energy could be explained, modeled, and integrated into mainstream physics. Maxwell's response was disarmingly calm. He welcomed the scrutiny. He even invited physicists to work alongside his engineering teams, not to validate his claims, but to update the frameworks they believed in. It wasn't a challenge. It was a strange kind of academic diplomacy. But while the debates raged, the coalition factories got to work. The first MSEDX production facility opened in Kigali, outfitted with CNC machines, testing benches, and modular assembly lines. The second launched in Accra, designed to specialize in control electronics and power conditioning units. The third, in Windhoek, focused on field testing under harsh desert conditions. These weren't massive gigafactories yet. They were seeds. And seeds grow. Videos emerged of technicians training rural mechanics on how to integrate MSEDX modules into irrigation pumps, refrigeration units, and microtransport vehicles. Suddenly, the device wasn't just a physics anomaly. It was a tool. A tool that could keep vaccines cold in remote regions, power lights in schools without waiting for grid extensions, and run water pumps without diesel supply chains. Then something unexpected happened. A group of young Kenyan physicists published a preprint paper proposing a new mathematical framework for what they tentatively called coherent spatial energy harmonics, a hypothesis that, while incomplete, attempted to describe the type of field interactions Maxwell insisted his device exploited. The paper didn't prove the device worked. But it did something more important. It suggested a path for physics to engage without dismissing the phenomenon outright. That paper was downloaded over 1 million times in 3 days. Suddenly, this wasn't just an engineering breakthrough. It was a scientific fork in the road. The conferences that once rejected Maxwell-themed abstracts now opened panel sessions on novel energy frameworks. Physicists who once mocked the idea in public began emailing students in private, "Send me everything you have." And somewhere in the middle of it all, hidden behind the headlines, was the quiet reality that terrified the old guard. Africa was no longer asking for permission to innovate. It was doing it. The story that began as a contested invention had evolved into a continental scientific awakening. Labs were being built. Students were being trained. Research was being funded. $100 million prize was no longer the headline. It was now the background noise behind a much bigger shift. As the world watched, one question remained unanswered. It started with a notice from the Pan-African Technology Council, normally a quiet bureaucratic body whose announcements rarely reached beyond policy circles. This time, the document spread like wildfire. The council proposed the formation of the world's first open scientific neutral zone, a digital platform where experimental data, replication results, and theoretical models related to emergent energy technologies could be shared without academic gatekeeping, corporate ownership, or national secrecy. In simple terms, a global research commons. No paywalls, no approvals from legacy journals, no patents blocking collaboration. Just data, instruments, and minds working together. And at the center sat the MSEDX dataset, waveform captures, thermal logs, field test recordings, and spectral measurements from devices in operation across 6 countries. For traditional academia, it was horrifying. For younger scientists, it was thrilling. For energy giants, it was alarming. For Maxwell, it was exactly the point. Because while others debated who should control the future, Maxwell quietly ensured no one could. The exact moment the world realized this was bigger than a device came during a late-night broadcast on international news. A foreign correspondent, visibly shaken, stood in front of a rural health clinic in Niger. Behind him, lights glowed in a building far from any power grid. The reporter explained that the clinic had been running for 3 weeks using a single MSEDX module powering refrigeration, diagnostics equipment, and lighting. No diesel generators. No solar arrays. No batteries. Just one humming metal box. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a megacity grid. It was something more dangerous to the status quo, proof that the device scaled downward to the people who needed it most. Governments took notice. Some, like Singapore and Brazil, requested cooperative testing agreements. Others, threatened by potential energy decentralization, quietly drafted bans and restrictions. Lobbyists floated new terminology: unregulated field energy, non-state power production, disruptive private grid activity. The language made clear what they feared, not the physics, but the independence. Maxwell maintained silence through all of this, refusing interviews, ignoring provocation, and directing his factories to increase training instead of production. Thousands of technicians, electricians, mechanics, and students began certification programs across Africa, teaching not just how to operate the devices, but how to diagnose, rebuild, and improve them. That's when the real shock hit. At a technology expo in Johannesburg, Maxwell's team rolled out a new demonstration, not of power generation, but of integration. On stage sat a completely off-grid microtown mock-up: streetlights, water pumps, cold storage, telecommunication nodes, and EV charging posts, all running from 3 MSEDX modules with no grid tie, no diesel backup, and no visible batteries. The demo ran all day, then all night, then through the weekend without refueling, without sun, without wind, and without fluctuation. Experts walked off the floor stunned. Investors walked off terrified. Physicists walked off with notebooks full of equations. The breakthrough wasn't the device. It was the ecosystem. Maxwell had figured out the part every disruptor in energy history failed at: the leap from prototype to infrastructure. And he did it without waiting for standards bodies, oil companies, or international agencies to prove it. The final twist came when a leaked memo surfaced from a major Western think tank, warning that if distributed African energy ecosystems became self-sustaining, traditional global energy influence could collapse, economically, strategically, and academically. The memo ended with one sentence underlined 3 times. The danger is not that the technology works, it's that it works without us. By the time the leak spread, it was too late. The narrative had shifted globally. Engineers in Vietnam requested training kits. A university in Mexico announced a new research track dedicated to emergent energy systems. A coalition of Pacific Island nations declared interest in adopting off-grid microtowns modeled after Maxwell's Expo demo. It was no longer a fight between physicists and a miracle machine, or between investors and an inventor. It had become a fight between 2 timelines: the old one, where power flowed through pipes and politics, and the new one, where power flowed directly to people. And somewhere, away from cameras and headlines, Maxwell wrote in his notebook a single sentence that would eventually leak months later: when energy stops being a commodity, the world stops being predictable. No one knew what he meant. Not yet. That uncertainty, between revolution and retaliation, became the defining atmosphere of the months that followed. Universities quietly split into 2 camps. One argued the MSEDX was a misinterpretation of known physics. The other, made up of younger faculty and grad students, argued the data demanded new models. The older camp mocked them as energy mystics. The younger camp responded by publishing replication attempts openly, bypassing legacy journals entirely. Then something unexpected happened. Replication didn't just succeed, it improved. A research group in South Korea reported a 4% gain in thermal stability using redesigned coil geometries. A team in Turkey documented reduced harmonic noise by modifying resonant cavities. A Brazilian collective built a ruggedized rural variant with dust-proof housings for agricultural use. None of these teams had ever met Maxwell. None had access to his manufacturing pipeline. None signed NDAs. Yet all advanced the field. That alone made the MSEDX the most disruptive technology of the century, not because it broke physical laws, but because it broke institutional ones. Knowledge itself had decentralized. And decentralization is something empires fear more than any machine. Energy companies responded the only way they knew how: through narratives. Editorials appeared in major newspapers warning of untested power sources and geopolitical instability caused by uncontrolled electrification. Financial analysts predicted catastrophic losses if the energy sector transitioned too quickly. Insurance firms floated policies that would deny coverage to any facility using non-standard power modules. On social media, bots swarmed comment threads. It began with a late-night broadcast from a modest university lab in Sao Paulo. A group of young engineers live-streamed their results after weeks of silence. They had built an open-source MSED derivative using only publicly available schematics, consumer-grade components, and parts from 3D printers. The device powered their entire lab, computers, oscilloscopes, lighting, HVAC, for 3 continuous days. No emissions, no fuel, no heat signatures. The stream went viral before it could be taken down. For the first time since the challenge began, Maxwell wasn't alone. The knowledge had escaped its container. Within 24 hours, 7 more labs across different continents announced similar breakthroughs. Not identical devices, variations. New shapes. New frequencies. New control logic. The ecosystem had mutated, diversified, and begun evolving on its own. That was the moment the $100 million prize became irrelevant. Physicists who once mocked the challenge quietly requested collaboration. Investors who once demanded patents now begged for a seat at the table. Governments who once denied the technology's legitimacy now scrambled to form policies around it. And the public, watching from the sidelines, finally understood why Maxwell had stayed silent through ridicule, bans, and investigations. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting for proof that a single human breakthrough, no matter how revolutionary, should not belong to one country, one corporation, or one institution. It should belong to everyone capable of building it. With the world spinning into realignment, an international symposium was organized, not by the old scientific establishment, but by a coalition of universities, community labs, and distributed energy groups who refused to wait for permission. Maxwell was invited, of course. And for the first time in years, he showed up in person. He didn't defend his invention. He didn't argue with physicists. He didn't talk about prizes or validation. He walked up to the microphone, looked around the room at students, researchers, engineers, and skeptics, and said one line: "If you need me to be right, you're missing the point. The point is that you're free to build." The audience didn't applaud at first. They just sat in silence, absorbing the weight of the words. Then, slowly, the room erupted, not with celebration, but with agreement. Nods. Determination. A collective realization that history doesn't move forward because of permission. It moves because someone refuses to stop. In the months that followed, the world fractured in unexpected ways. Legacy energy markets shrank as microgrids spread across rural landscapes. Nations once dependent on oil royalties began diversifying into advanced manufacturing. Technical schools rolled out new energy curriculums. Entire green bureaucracies collapsed under the pressure of irrelevance. Physicists rewrote frameworks to accommodate phenomena once dismissed as impossible. And the great geopolitical fear that distributed power would undo global hierarchy proved true. Not through uprising or war, but through something far more disruptive to the old world. Self-sufficiency. No sanctions can control a village that generates its own power. No embargo can threaten a nation that doesn't need fuel. No empire can dominate a world that no longer competes for scarcity. In the end, the story wasn't about a man outsmarting physicists or a prize validating a miracle. It wasn't even about the machine. It was about the day humanity realized energy didn't have to be owned to be real. Maxwell retreated from the spotlight after that. He declined interviews, turned down awards, and halted commercial expansion entirely. Not because he was tired, but because his role was over. Civilization had reached the point where it no longer required a hero, a pioneer, or a disruptor. It required builders. And somewhere in a small workshop, the kind of place where revolutions always begin, a group of students worked late into the night. They soldered, calculated, argued, and tested. They weren't waiting for permission, validation, or applause. They were building.